Welcome to Earth Grief Doula. I'm Susan Meeker-Lowry. Today I want to share a little bit more of my son Jason's death. I've mentioned it in a few of the videos. I haven't really gone into a lot of detail, and I'm not going to go into huge detail today, but I wanted to tell a little bit of the story because it's important, and it's what got me here. Jason was my oldest, and he died when he was 36 years old in 2013 of an opioid overdose. He left behind me, his dad, we were separated, divorced, his two brothers, and two sons, Nick and Silas. Nick was 13, Silas was 9. I knew he was a heroin addict. And for a few years, he would manage it in such a way that he was able to continue his work as an organic dairy farmer, and he also had a small sustainable logging business. He didn't own the organic dairy farm. He worked on the farm, and he had been working on the farm since he was about 16 years old. He was living in a house on the farm that was built for him and his family by the farmer, Joe. And things went from bad to worse economically. Joe had a bad accident. Jason ran the farm for a year while he recovered, and the farm did really well. But then when Joe got back from his recovery and took over, things started to fall apart. And around that time, the economy also started to fall apart. So there were a lot of issues that came, and Jason's addiction during that hard time got worse. He tried numerous times to get clean. He got counseling. I believe he went to Narcotics Anonymous a few times. He was on butamorphine, which is a drug that helps addicts not have the cravings. It satisfies those cravings, but it doesn't get them high. And, he was such a wonderful person and such a soft heart. He loved animals. He would do anything for you, for his friends, and for the people that he loved. And pretty much everybody loved Jason. And pretty much they did ever since he was a little boy. Anyway, I knew he was an addict, but I wanted to, I lived in Maine, he was in Vermont, and I wasn't in denial in that sense of the word, but I told myself that he was going to be fine. I also realized, of course, that I had no power over what he did or didn't do. He also kept a lot of what was going on from me. And since I didn't see him every day, that was pretty easy. And because I wanted to believe that he was fine, I chose to believe that he was and that he would be okay. But for the last few months of his life, it became obvious that that wasn't the case. He lost his home. His relationship fell apart. He eventually lost he and his partner shared custody of the two boys equally. So they would be 2 weeks with him and 2 weeks with her. And during this time, he lost custody because obviously he didn't have a home. And being a dad was really important to him. And so I feel that when that happened and he no longer had a home, it just took the heart right out of him. Even so, he tried many times to get treatment. He checked himself into rehab centers. He only had insurance from Medicaid insurance. This was 2013. And it didn't cover anything at all, really. Basically, the first time he checked into the Brattleboro retreat in Brattleboro, Vermont, they only were able to keep him for 3 days because technically heroin is no longer in your system after 3 days. And so he was basically no longer an addict. But of course, he was an addict. And I remember it was a terrible snowstorm, one of the worst snowstorms that was predicted for Vermont at the time. and he was having to leave because the money from his insurance wouldn't pay for him to be there another day, even though he would get in his car during one of these terrible snowstorms and drive back to Barrie, which is where he lived. And so he called me really upset because he didn't want to leave. He wanted to stay there. He knew that he was not able to stay clean after just 3 days. And so I called and I spoke with the director and I spoke with his doctors. And I said, please, can't you at least keep him overnight so that when he leaves, he's not heading back to Barrie in a bad snowstorm? And the end result was no, they couldn't do that. And I remember saying, well, I said, I hope he doesn't get in an accident and die because he's driving in a bad snowstorm. And the man on the other end of the phone said to me, oh, don't say that. I said, well, I have to say that. I'm his mom. And I had to face that possibility. So there was that. And then he finally got on a waiting list to have a 30-day in-house treatment. And the time came. I paid for a taxi. Again, I was in Maine. He was in Vermont. I paid for a taxi for him to get there. He got there when he was supposed to, and he showed up. And the next thing I know, I get a phone call from him. And he's telling me that that he can't be there because of an unforeseen conflict of interest, which they would not explain to him. My heart was broken. The taxi driver that took him to that place, his heart was broken because Jason obviously wanted help. He was begging for help. And they were telling him no because there was some nebulous secret conflict of interest that they couldn't divulge, that they had to have known about. I mean, I can't even imagine what it was. They did say, oh, it's nothing Jason did. I'm like, well, of course it isn't. He's not there yet. And so I was really, really angry. And I knew in that moment that I had lost my son. This was in March. Jason was dead in May. He did not overdose on purpose, as we later realized, because the coroner's report said that he had in his system a dose of fentanyl consistent with a heroin dose. And of course, he died instantly because that much fentanyl is deadly. And he obviously didn't know that that's what he was taking. And obviously, therefore, someone, I don't know if it was the person who sold him the drug or if it was the person who sold him the drug, but somebody knew there was fentanyl and somebody literally murdered him. And there were 3, I believe, other overdoses in the same town during that same 2-week period of time. So whoever did that was responsible for my son's death. And I think another one, when you overdose, you don't necessarily die. I mean, at least if you're overdosing on an actual dose of heroin. And this was before people carried around the, I can't remember what it is, the shot that, the Narla, whatever, I can't pronounce it right. Anyway, nobody had that, and I don't know if it would have worked anyway. But in any case, I tried desperately to get the certification taken away from the place that refused to treat him. And then they came back and said, yeah, they told me there was a conflict of interest. And I said, well, did they tell you what it was? And they said, no, they can't. And I'm like, I felt like if they couldn't tell what the conflict of interest was, then how was I supposed to know that there really was anything? I wrote letters after Jason died, I wrote letters to all of the places that he had been to and to the governor of Vermont, because I wanted him to know the experience that my son had gone through and that I had gone through that led to his death. The only person who actually responded to those letters was the governor of Vermont. So anyway, Jason died. And after he did, I felt like I didn't want to live. At first, it was hard to believe. Um, I didn't find out through normal ways. One of his girlfriends, one of his ex girlfriends, whom I loved like a daughter, called me as I was reading a book on perfume. And I never forget that because I was on like page 20 of that book, and I have not yet, it's been 10 years, I have not yet been able to pick that book up and finish reading it. And so I was reading this book, and she called and she asked me how I was doing. And I hadn't heard from her in a while because she and Jason had broken up basically over drugs. And she said to me, "Oh, you don't know." And I was like, "No, what?" And she said, "Well, Jason had an overdose." And I said, "Oh," I said, how is he? Where is he?" She was like, "He died." And I had just talked to Jason earlier that night. And luckily, the last thing I told him was, "I love you." And the last thing he told me was, "I love you, Mom." And I'm so grateful for that. And she felt terrible, of course. And I couldn't believe it. I said, "Oh, I'm going to call Ethan, his brother, and I'm going to, I'll see what's going on and I'll get back to you." Of course, she already knew he was dead, but she also was devastated because she thought I had known. She did not want to be the one to tell me. So I called Ethan, my son, and he was in New York at the time. And I said, "I just got a call." And I told him, and he said, yes. He said she was right. And he's like, he had gotten a phone call from the police, and they wanted my phone number so that they could call me, so that they could call the Freiburg police and have the Freiburg police come and knock on my door and tell me that my son was dead. And they said, "No, we don't want Mom to find out that way. We're going to get in the car. We're going to drive over." He and my other son, Colin, were going to get in the car and drive over so that they could be the ones to tell me. And they were getting ready to leave at that point. And so the cop agreed that that was okay. So Ethan told me. And I was in shock. I couldn't think. I couldn't wrap my mind around it. I certainly did not wake up my sister and tell her. The person I called finally was one of my oldest friends who had lost her daughter when she was only 16 in a car accident, one of those horrible drunk driving accidents that happens all too often on prom night. And I knew she would understand. She was the only person I could think of that I could actually talk to. And so I called her and I told her. And we talked a little bit. And then I couldn't tell my sister. I managed to get through the night, and I managed to wake up in the morning, and I managed to act to my sister as though everything was okay. And because I couldn't tell her, I had to wait until Ethan and Colin got there before I could even allow myself to absorb what had happened. And I remember in the days that followed, I remember actually waking up one morning and looking in the mirror at myself. And I thought, I'm going to pretend that Jason didn't die. I am going to see how that feels because I can't deal with this. And I actually felt that madness of desperately wanting to live in that denial, in that space of denial. But I couldn't. I remember going out to the garden bench one late afternoon, early evening. It was in May, obviously, and it was lighter later. And so I went out to the garden bench that was just outside the garden fence that Jason had made for me years before, after I first moved back to Freiburg and started my garden. And he made this potting bench for me. And I leaned against it and I looked in the garden and I looked up at the mountains and I just started keening. I felt as though my arms and legs were being literally torn from my body. I felt like I was burning with fire inside and I was being ripped apart. And the sounds that came out of me, I didn't recognize myself. I keened and keened and keened and keened. I could not stop. And there was a woman at the time who had a trailer that she had parked on our property because that's where she lived. And she had come out of her trailer and was standing under the apple tree in the backyard, just witnessing. And when I finally was able to stop, and I turned around and Karen was there, and she looked at me and she said, "Are you okay?" And I said, "No, but I will be." And I knew that somehow I was going to survive, whether I wanted to or not. And we planned a celebration for Jason's life in Vermont, in Northfield, in the place where, when we lived there, when the kids were growing up, where we hung out basically it was our home, away from home. We were family at Patty and Scott's. And Scrag Mountain is where Jason's ashes were scattered. Because they used to go there a lot, the kids. And there was a cabin up there. And when they went up there to bring his ashes, they found where he had written in the book that they kept for people who stayed there, to write like a note or whatever. And Jason had written a poem in there. And the celebration for his life was such a magical event. Everybody who was supposed to be there was there. Patty's kids, Jason's brothers and sisters, because that's how we felt, created a playlist to play the whole time that the event was going on. Time literally stood still. It was like people arrived and we would hang out with them for a little bit and then they would go out back. And then more people would arrive, and it was like, it felt like the day should be over, but only an hour had passed. It was like such a gift. People came that I hadn't seen, his friends that I hadn't seen since high school, who drove to be there because people loved Jason. And it was a beautiful and heartbreaking event that I'm always grateful for. It was really magical, if those things can possibly be magical. And I remember when I left to head for home, you know how when you drive off and you're in your car for a while and then the locks lock, usually it happens fairly quickly. Well, I remember specifically when those locks locked. And it didn't happen until I was off the mountain, which is where Patty and Scott lived, off of the mountain. It was like that whole space was in a different world. It was somehow connected, but separate. And when I got to a certain place on the road down from the house, then time became what everybody else was experiencing, and my car locked. That's all I could think of. The ashes, I was not able to go to the top of Scragg with his brothers and the others who went to scatter his ashes the day after the celebration for his life. It had been a very wet spring, and it was very muddy, and it was a hike, and I just didn't think I could make it. And a bad storm was coming, and I wanted to leave and be through the notches before it hit. But so they took off for the top of Scragg with Jason's ashes, and I got in the car and drove home to Maine. And the story was, when they got to the top of Scragg, the storm was rolling in, and there were these big gray clouds and flashes of lightning. And as the ashes were scattered out, the flashes of lightning came, and the wind came and took the ashes. And it was a really, really intense experience. And then the storm really hit, and the kids were basically running down the mountain with the empty urn after scattering his ashes. And later I learned that Jason's favorite song was Ride the Lightning by Metallica. And it just seemed to me so appropriate that when his ashes were scattered, the lightning was striking, and the winds were blowing, and he was literally riding the lightning. It took me years to come back to life after that. It took me, if it wasn't for the garden, I don't know if I would have survived. The garden gave me a place to mourn. It gave me important work to do, physical work. It nurtured me. It took me out of myself when I was busy doing things and digging and weeding and planting and harvesting and just being there. It held me while I mourned and grieved. And I still mourn and grieve. And what I realized is that as I finally started coming back to myself and caring whether I felt well or what I looked like or whether I had energy or whether I was eating properly or whatever, all of these things that we do to take care of ourselves so that we can be healthy and we can do what we want to do and be who we need to be. It took me like 2.5 to 3 years to get to the point where I wanted to do those things again. Like I felt like, yes, I need to do this for myself. I didn't care. Even though I still had 2 living children and 5 grandchildren, I didn't care. But eventually I did. And what really got me out of it was my friends literally coming and dragging me out of the house to get involved fighting a pumping station and a bottling plant that Nestle was proposing for our small town of Freiburg, for their Poland Spring water brand, which is now owned by Blue Triton because it was sold, like, I don't know if it was last year, recently, in the past. And so getting back into activism helped. I wasn't really ready yet, but the time had come. Nestle was there. The work needed to be done. And my friends, some of whom I had just met, knew that I had the skills to do what needed to be done. And I did too. And I thought, okay, I have to do this. And I wasn't as good at it as I had been in the past. I didn't want to go to all the meetings. I didn't want to speak in front of people. I didn't want to be that voice that I had been in the past. I didn't feel ready. I didn't trust myself. I wasn't happy with how I looked. It was just like, but I had to do it, and I did. And that helped bring me back to life as well. So I know this has been long, and I'm not even sure if I'm going to show it, but I just felt that I wanted to share it because that grief for Jason that I still feel, that I have not healed from, the wound is there, it bleeds sometimes still. That grief is what is fueling my love right now for Earth. After my friend, whom I told you I called, after Jason died, after her daughter died, she joined Mothers Against Drunk Driving, and that really helped her. And she was able to help other parents going through what she went through. And it was a really important part of her healing. And I so admired her strength to do that because, yes, there were plenty of things I could have done. There was to help addicts or the families of addicts, to even maybe help prevent somebody from losing their son like I lost mine. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. I couldn't bring myself to talk about it. I couldn't bring myself to put it out there, not because of any shame over how he died, but just because I could not bring myself to do it. And, but now I feel differently. It's been 10 years this May 2023, it'll be 10 years. And it's taken that long for me to be able to really even talk about it besides with somebody one-on-one who already knows. Because it's so raw. But it is also so empowering to know what I've moved through and to feel the strength that I have, because I have already experienced such pain from this loss that I feel like, I hope to God I don't ever have to go through losing another son or a grandchild. But I feel that I survived, and I have a strength and a wisdom and a compassion and empathy that I didn't have before. I didn't have it when I was the activist speaking on behalf of ancient trees. I didn't have it when I was doing that work. I didn't have the connection to the earth in the same way because I hadn't been gardening for 25 years in one place. But now I have those things. And now I feel like the grief that I experienced in Jason's death, that's fueling what I'm doing now. He is with me, and he is supporting me, and he is saying, "You go, Mom." And that's what I'm doing. And so that's the story. And for good or ill.